So let's close out this chapter by looking at another aspect of how life has changed, or how complexity has evolved in the context of the barriers to sustainable development. This is called changing antagonistic threats. The last key process of change that I want to briefly mention is the changing nature of antagonistic threats. The intense wars between states of our past have been increasingly transformed into low-intensity conflicts between more varied type of parties, from being generally both spatially bounded, with notable exceptions such as the Napoleonic Wars and the two World Wars. Modern conflicts have increasingly been extending beyond borders and over time. So this is an example used here. The Karamojong warriors during a disarmament exercise in northeast Uganda. I don't know why that's used as a prop, but nonetheless enough to suggest a distinction between old and new wars. You can go on this discussing this along over a long range of issues. As I mentioned before, Syrian war, Israel and Hamas, Russia and Ukraine. Wars are not just wars. There are many countries indirectly or directly involved in funding these wars, supplying arms and weapons and people sometimes, and there are motivations to start such wars, keep them going, and so on. As I said, my own philosophy is that maybe globalization is a kind of a deterrent to a world war again, because everybody is now interdependent. But anyways, in addition to the transforming face of armed conflict, antagonistic threats are also changing in relation to various forms of terrorism, sometimes referred to as increasing asymmetrical threats. The more geographically bounded organizations using terrorist activities to fight for a localized cause in the past have got company in loose global networks using terror to fight for global systemic change. So Hamas is supported by Iran and by the Hezbollah, and South Africa sued Israel in the World Court for genocide and lost, of course, and so on and so forth. So you can see that conflicts may remain locally bounded, but they are connected still globally. Terrorism and warfare are also increasingly spreading to the digital dimension of our modern world, with cybersecurity being on everybody's lips. I already mentioned this several times. The distinction between armed conflict and the fight against terrorism is increasingly often blurred, frequently leading to what can only be referred to as attempts to crack a nut with a sledgehammer. Okay, so where else does it go? The result being serious collateral damage, which, at least in my mind, could have counterproductive effects, as injustice and suffering may further spur support to an involvement in terrorist organizations. The blurring of warfare and fight against terrorism is also at times undermining international law, such as the detention of individuals without trial or increasingly frequent drone attacks against targets within the borders of sovereign states. This plays out a lot. US went and killed Osama bin Laden. India was accused of trying to kill its state enemies in US, in Canada, and everybody is doing it. I'm sure Russia is, of course, killing people all over the world that it considers a threat or unreasonable to their statehood, whatever. Crime is also changing from individual or small bands of thieves or bandits operating in particular geographical areas to increasingly organized and international crime cartels. Although organized crime has been around for centuries, with examples such as the Chinese triads or Italian mafia, what is changing is the increasing geographic spread and reach of such organizations. Today, we have various forms of organized crime cartels on all continents, many with regional and even global tentacles reaching and competing with each other, well organized, well equipped, and with what is seemingly upper hand against our law enforcement agencies. Of course, There are many countries, let's say like North Korea, which are accused of using state-sponsored machinery to loot banks and cryptocurrencies and siphon off money through via frauds, right? So concluding the chapter then, the symptoms of the unsustainable state we are in are many and growing. Sustainable development is continuously undermined by various destructive events, some of which are sudden and spectacular, while others are gradual and mundane. Giddens may be right when stating that we live in a world where hazards created by ourselves are as or more threatening than those that come from the outside. Especially if considering the actual impact of human activity on many of the hazards traditionally seen as being fully determined by natural processes. When also considering human activity as almost exclusively determining how vulnerable individuals, communities, or societies are to the impact of various hazards, it's clear that we have not only the capacity to reduce the risk of all these types of symptomatic events, but the moral obligation to assist others with less capacity to do so. So this is kind of a normative statement, but is it part of the sustainable development? It should be, because sustainable development is only possible if the entire globe is involved and globalization is working within the framework of sustainable development, which means you have to carry those that are most vulnerable. Sustainable development is sustainable development is in other words dependent on us making conscious decisions and taking intentional actions to reduce risk of anything that potentially could divert us away from the world that we want for now and for the future. Managing risk for sustainable development is, however, complicated by ongoing process of change that continuously transform our risk landscape. Our future can no longer be expected to be an extrapolation of our past, as our world is increasingly complex and dynamic, demanding us to integrate multiple and sometimes escalating processes of change in our assessment of our future. We know what we need to do, and we are increasingly figuring out how to do it. That's an optimistic message. But obviously, we could never extrapolate the past to figure out the future, because when we went from hunter-gatherers or pre-agrarian society to agrarian and industrial, there were always changes unexpected, big, and not extrapolatable from the past. So now we talk about the speed of change, socio-technical transitions that leave people behind, and so on. So can sustainable development make sure that we don't disconnect continuously in time every few decades or whatever, in terms of jumping to a new state, right? That would be the goal of sustainable development, that even when change happens, it carries everybody forward in a equitable and just manner. We also desperately need to get over the old truth so eloquently described by George Orwell. People can foresee the future only when it coincides with their own wishes, and the most grossly obvious facts can be ignored when they are unwelcome. So rational ignorance is a big part of our evolution, and often it's useful for surviving, because if you start worrying about everything, then you will go crazy, right? It's time to wake up and realize that we are on a dangerous path, and we cannot afford any longer to be delayed by the climate deniers and others who are sowing doubt in our minds about uncertainty in our expectations of our future. So we can have a sustainable future, and we can increasingly figure out how to get there, is an optimistic message. I like optimistic vision for the future. The future will always be uncertain, but the best thing we can do is to act the best way we can with the best information we have at hand. Right now we have more or less unanimous information pointing toward a not at all desirable future if we continue as we have done in the past. We must act on it now. Okay, so with that kind of a exhortation by the author on sustainable development. We'll move to the next chapter on managing risk and what it entails. The next chapter will have a lot of text to read because there are a lot of definitions, some of which are from the literature and some of which are author's own interpretation of the literature. So we will end up reading a lot of text, but it's very useful because it sets the stage for the following chapters in terms of analysis and how to think about sustainable development and where we want to get to in terms of changing the world, right?